Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today we're going to be breaking down the best free agents the Jaguars could sign this offseason to fill the needs on the roster. So with the salary cap crunch they'll be facing, we'll focus more on affordable solutions that could free up the team to take the best players available in the 2023 NFL Draft. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. So, just as an overview of this situation and how the salary cap looks for the Jaguars, heading in the last offseason, it was a very different story for this team. Had a lot of money available. They had saved over the recent years. They rolled over a lot of cap from previous seasons, and they decided to take advantage of that. And they spent a historic amount of money, more than any team has ever spent in a free agency period in NFL history. They brought in a ton of great players. We can name them. We've got guys like Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, Brandon Scherf, Foye Oluokun, Darius Williams, and you could throw out some other names on that list as well. They did a ton of work to the roster, and we saw a lot of success come from it, and we even got to see a little playoff run, which, if you would have told me a year ago this team was making the playoffs and they were going to win a playoff game, would have been hard for me to believe it. So that's the approach they took last offseason. And because of that approach and these contracts they've signed that were more backloaded, had money against the cap more down the road, now the Jaguars are in a situation where they really don't have a ton of money to spend this season. And there's going to be a lot of work that they're going to have to do. So before we hop into some of these players I want to bring up that you could keep your eye on for free agency, we're just going to look at the salary cap. Let's take a look at some things they could do. So you'll see here, we've got a list of, I believe, 9 players on here. Now, first thing to notice, Blake Hance, this is representing Calvin Ridley. This is not actually Blake Hance. The way that this website works, and I've brought this up in previous videos, because Calvin Ridley is not reinstated, his salary cap is not counted yet, and because he's not reinstated, he's listed way down this list under the 51-man cutoff. So we can't get his cap to count, so we have to sign another player to the same deal. So Blake Hance is our placeholder, essentially. We've got 8 other players we're looking at bringing back to this team. So really your notable losses, and this is just trying to be a little more realistic about how the Jaguars could look to deal with the situation. Juwan Taylor is your most notable loss. I think that's pretty clear. He's talked about right now to be going for $15 million a year, and I think you can afford that. You can find a way, and you see, like, even in our cap space, there is room to re-sign him, but we also need to save some money to fill the needs on this roster before the draft. And so maybe the Jaguars feel like they're confident enough in Walker Little to where they want to start him and maybe get someone else to develop and go a different route. But Juwan Taylor's one guy we don't have re-signed on here. Marvin Jones is another player, and I think that's just a situation where for Marvin, well, he could look to stay with the Jaguars and try to win a Super Bowl. I think the best move for him as far as his earnings and him as a player long term, obviously talking about a 33-year-old player, but I think the best thing for him is to go to a rebuilding team. And we saw him do that with Jacksonville. He came here, he was one of the starting receivers, and the year before last, he was, I think, pretty arguably the number 1 receiver on the team. So Marvin Jones, I think that's the best route for him. And if he wants to come back and sign a cheap deal, I'm all for it. But I think for him, he would be best suited to look for a rebuilding team and get a starting role there, because I think he's still very much good enough to start in this league. Other players on here, we don't really have any huge notable losses. Maybe you could note CJ Beathard just as a backup and I just don't have him re-signed because of the deals they've signed. Specifically with Nathan Rourke, it seems like he might be a future backup for this team. Now, maybe not. We're talking about backup quarterback for the Jaguars, so whichever way they go, they decide to go, and hopefully it plays no impact at all. So, this is the situation that we find ourselves in. We've signed all of these players back to deals. DeJuan Smoot, you'll notice, his deal is not worth as much as it has been in the past. And the reason why is because he might be out part of this next season. And so if he wants to come back to Jacksonville, I don't think he's going to get paid fully for this next season. So you got to factor that into his contract. And then we also on here decided to re-sign not only Evan Ingram, but Chris Manhertz. And we'll talk more about that once we get to the tight end position in our breakdown. But this is what we're looking like. And so we have, with 42 players on the team in this scenario, which is how many you're going to have if you're having 9 selections, because then you add those 9, you get to 51, and that's the guys that count towards the salary cap. So we've got 18.1 million available, and it's roughly 9.9 million that this team needs for the draft. So you give yourself about $8.2 million to work with in free agency. So you're not going to fill all your needs most likely, but you can fill the big ones. And I think the biggest needs up for this team arguably are on defense. And I think that the best way to fill the needs this offseason is to look primarily to fill the defensive needs in free agency. And then maybe we look at the draft as more of an offensive-focused one. There's going to be a lot of players, I think, that make sense for the Jaguars in each of these rounds that are more focused on the offensive side of the ball. So with this breakdown, we'll go ahead, we'll start talking about players so we don't waste too much time going through things that we've already talked about. If you want to see a breakdown on the salary cap in depth, and you'll see a little bit different of a scenario in that video, you can go back on our channel. We've got one entirely dedicated to it. So we've got today about 6 positions that we're going to talk about. Not all of them equal in terms of need, but still things you would like to work on. So the first one we're going to do is talk about Samaje Perine and the running back position. So Jacksonville obviously has the number 1 running back. They've got Travis Etienne. They love the way Etienne's played. You got no concerns with him really as a player at this point, because your only problem was the fumbling, and I would argue that issue went away late in the season. After so long, it seemed like he outgrew it, and ultimately, we'll probably see him fumble here and there, but I don't think it's going to be something that's going to take the limelight again. So, with that said, one thing that Etienne is not great at right now is pass blocking. And I think as well, it would be great for this team to get a second running back that can fill in really well as a starter and just fits the team. And so for me, I do think the best way you address this is through the draft, because you can get someone for cheap. You can get them in the mid rounds or the late rounds and probably hit. So that would be my preferred way. But if you're looking to address this in free agency, if he's available, I think Samaje Perine makes a lot of sense, because not only did we see him with the Bengals play really great as a starter, but we also saw him do good at pass blocking. We saw him do good in the receiving game. 2 things that the Jaguars could look to improve at the running back position. That's one reason why I really like Kenny McIntosh in the draft process, is because of the receiving element of his game as an offensive weapon. But one thing he doesn't have is the pass blocking. And so we see with Perine, that's something he can do. You look at his pass blocking grades throughout this year. You got one big doozy against Tennessee, But then you've got only 2 other ones that are, kind of mid, I guess you could say, and the rest of it's just really good grades. As a run blocker, you're not going to be worried about that. He's a running back. So you look at that, and then you look at the way he filled in for Cincinnati. You look at his role as a pass catcher. I think he'd make a ton of sense as a second running back in Jacksonville. I think it would be a good move. So as far as the contract with Samaje Perine, he's estimated around $3 million a year right now. I think the Jaguars, if they signed a 2-year deal, could get him for about 5.5 or 6 million. So it wouldn't be a huge hit to the cap. It'd be affordable. And you would add a really good insurance policy and complimentary running back to your backfield. So as a move, I like it. I think it's a good way the Jaguars could look, but at the same time, maybe it's better to look at in the draft. So we'll go to the next guy. Let's talk about Mecole Hardman in the receiver position. So the Jaguars obviously have their starters. You've got Calvin Ridley, Christian Kirk, and Zay Jones. Those are your top guys. Behind that, the only player that is currently on the roster for this next season is Jamal Agnew. And I think this team could look to use Jamal Agnew more. And hey, if they do, I think you could argue that the Jaguars don't really need another receiver that's specifically a speed threat that bad. But if they don't look to change something with the way they use Agnew, which I would assume he will probably be around in kind of the same role, mainly as a kind of change of pace guy on the offense and then a really good returner. If they don't use him in a bigger role, look at a receiver like Mecole Hardman for this team. I think he could be a really smart choice to add, not only because he fits the team by adding a speed threat, the one thing that I think the receiving position really lacks right now, but in addition, he's going to be dirt cheap, I think, compared to what you expected to pay him. And you look at, for example, what Marquez Valdes-Scantling got with the Kansas City Chiefs. He was I think around 10 million a year, maybe 9 million, somewhere in that range. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's kind of close to where he was. Mecole Hardman on that same team, obviously injuries hurt him the most. He didn't outproduce Valdes-Scantling that much in games, really ever. I mean, I would argue that MVS was the better receiver this last year. It's not because I don't think that Mecole Hardman can be good. I just don't think this was a good year for him. And so we saw the Jaguars hop on these players that had a lot of potential last offseason, primarily at the receiving position. And, I'd even throw an Evan Ingram to that mix. What if they did it again with Hardman? I think that's a move that would benefit this team a ton, and it gives you an insurance policy at receiver. If you get a guy who goes down, you throw in Hardman. You know he can start. You know he can do it. And so, as far as what we're looking at for a contract with Mecole Hardman, my estimate right now, which it's kind of all over the place, you could see him get paid way too much for what he did. I think you could sign him for about $6.5 million a year. I think you could get him at $19.5 million over 3 years. And if you did that, you can backload that deal. You don't got to spend a ton right now on it, and you pay him a little more down the road and have a 3rd-year option to, leave that deal. So I think he's probably, out of all the receivers, the best fit for Jacksonville. But another name, just to throw in there, you could look at Parris Campbell. Maybe he's a little cheaper, because Campbell is a player injured a lot. He really had concerns with that. He did play healthy last year and had more volume in the receiving game, way more than in the past. But I don't know if he played good enough to prove that he's a starter in the NFL to the Colts. And so you could see the Colts move on and him just have to take a good deal. And what better team to take a deal from if you're abandoned by your drafted team than the one that's their rival in the division? I mean, I'm sure he played pretty good in those 2 games at least. But point is, with Campbell, you get another speed threat. You get a player who's about as young. I think he's slightly older than Hardman, but around that same age, and kind of fits the same role. And maybe he's a little cheaper too. Hardman's had more production in his time. So 2 guys to look at. Just wanted to throw in that second option. Now we'll talk about tight end for a moment here. Now, obviously, tight end we're considering a need. And the reason why is that even if you're bringing back Ingram, which you fully expect to, you don't have a second tight end you can rely on. The room is very void of players at this point. You'd have Luke Farrell as your other guy. So the best thing for this team would be to bring back one of their tight ends outside of Evan Ingram and Luke Farrell, or to pick up another guy. And so for me, honestly, I think the best case scenario for the offseason is you do draft a tight end that fits really well into this team. But if you're going to address this in free agency, why not just bring back Chris Manhertz? He's not going to cost a lot. It's not like he's taken a huge step forward as a team, but you know he's good at one thing. He's really good as a blocker. He is among the best in the NFL at that position and in that role. And I think that's what you're missing from Ingram. And we've even seen Manhertz go out as a catcher at times. We know he still can do that. So why not bring him back for cheap? I mean, I think you could get him for, heck, $5 million, 2 years. That's not a lot of money. And if that gives you someone who can help with your run blocking, just make sure you have someone behind, I think you're fine. And then you're not pigeonholed in having a drafted tight end early. I still think it would be good. But just to make sure you're not going to have this huge void at the position. So that's something I would consider. And then obviously we talked about Ingram. Ingram you want back. He played great here. I think he's a top 5 tight end in the NFL. You got to keep him on the team. Do everything you can for that. So let's look at our last offensive spot that we're going to discuss. So we're going to talk about guard. We're going to talk about a player we mentioned before. So Isaac Seumalo. So Seumalo is kind of an underrated player. I hate using that word because you want to call a lot of players underrated and overuse it. But he really is. As a player, he's one of the better guards in the NFL. And I think if you brought him into Jacksonville, you're going to upgrade your team as a whole on the offensive line. And it's going to help your running game. It's going to help your passing game. It just does a lot. And Seumalo, another thing to keep in mind with him, you may be able to tell when you just look at the draft year and the draft team, Doug Peterson selected him. He added him to his team. So the two already have a relationship. And Peterson very much liked him in his time in Philly. You know, these aren't two guys that have like burnt bridges from something. They were definitely people who got along. And I think that connection not only helps you kind of elevate yourself among the other teams, but maybe he trusts you more. And you don't have to pay him as much because he knows that part of the deal is getting to be on a really good team. He's already going to be able to trust Peterson because he won a Super Bowl with him. So Seumalo is a fantastic fit, I think, for the Jaguars at guard. Now here's the problem. Out of almost all of these free agents we're going to talk about, he's the most expensive. He's going to cost a bit, and there's arguments he's going to go for over $10 million a year. If he's going for that, I don't think you hit that position in free agency. I think you just trust Ben Barch, and you upgrade if you can. That's probably the better route to go. But if Seumalo, say he goes for like $9 million, $8 million a year, I think you absolutely could consider that. I think he's a good enough player to absolutely over-exceed that contract. So he'd be a really good person to bring in. He's played left guard for the Eagles, so he fits in to the hole on your roster right off the bat. So that's another name to definitely know. That's one that's been floated around a little bit, so you might have heard of him before. If you've followed our website or some of these videos, you'll probably have heard of him from us already. So another name to keep your eyes on this offseason. So now that we've talked about offense, we've really got two spots on the defense, and we are going to talk about three players when discussing those. So you have your pass rush, and a lot of people argue it's the interior of the defensive line. That's where it needs the most help. Well, what I think is going to happen this offseason, I might be wrong, I think that for this defense, and they kind of hinted at considering it in the press conferences at the end of the year, I think what's going to happen is they're going to move on from Roy Robertson Harris. Not that that was hinted, but he's an obvious cap savings opportunity. You save about $8 million cutting him, and that opens up a spot on the defensive line where I think Trayvon Walker fits great. That's where he played in college. That's where he's been the most successful for the team. I think you put him back on the defensive line. He helps out the interior. Heck, I mean, if you got to line him up at like nose tackle or just in the middle of the defensive line, he can do it. And that might be something they do more down the line as he continues to grow more comfortable as an NFL player. But I think that's a fantastic move for this team. So if you move him to the defensive line, now your need is that 3-4 outside linebacker. I believe strong side linebacker as well. So if you want to bring in a veteran presence to fill that, which is what you're going to get in free agency, a cheap one, someone who's been productive recently, bring in Justin Houston. I think that is a fantastic pairing for the defense this offseason. We'll swap over to defense, obviously, here. But Houston, on the season, and this looks a little off. I don't think he had 12 sacks. Houston had a lot of production in the sack department this offseason. He's a heck of a player. He's not a full-time guy anymore. He's been around in the NFL for quite a while. But the guy can still produce at a really high level. He's still a very effective player. And so what you saw him do in Baltimore this last year, he played about 500 snaps on the year, basically on the field about half the time. And when he was on the field, he had a huge impact. He was able to get to the quarterback a lot. You see on here, just for the defensive grade, he graded higher than like almost every person on the Jaguars defense. You know how much he was paid? $3.5 million. That's all he was paid. And I'm sure he'll go for a little more this offseason. Whether that's $5 or $6 million. But would I sign that deal? Absolutely. I'd bring him in on that deal. I'd consider bringing him in on a 2-year deal. But I think that's a move that could instantly elevate your pass rush. Gives you a leadership presence there. Not that you don't have any leaders. I think Josh Allen has done a great job at that. But I think this defense could use someone who's up in age like that, who has been around the game. Someone who had 22 sacks in an NFL season. That kind of player, I think, is what the Jaguars could use. You get him for cheap, and you tell him, hey, we're going to go try to win the Super Bowl this year. You want to come? I mean, that's what he's looking for. That's why he signed with Baltimore, out of all teams. It's a huge part of that, because that team had Super Bowl aspirations the last 2 years, and heck, they might still if they keep Lamar Jackson. So that's my obvious choice, I think, for the pass rush, if you get the move of Trayvon Walker to the defensive line. Now, if they keep him at 3-4 outside linebacker, then the need turns out to be someone who's going to play with their hand in the dirt and be effective in that role. At that point, I think the best thing is to address that in the draft. But for names, it's going to be a little different. Maybe you're looking more at a player like Javon Hargrave or Dalvin Tomlinson. Hargrave would obviously be extremely expensive, but super effective player. Still do a lot. I just think what's best for the defense is just to simply move Trayvon Walker to where he played more in college and help him find success in that role. Maybe you can play him at outside linebacker here and there, just as a extra part of his game, but I think this makes more sense. So now that we hit the pass rush, we're going to finish this off with two guys for the slot corner position, which is the one big, obvious, clear need in the secondary. You got guys at all the other positions. You saw how good Andre Cisco could be. Rayshawn Jenkins had a career year, and both your corners, once they were both playing outside, they were both lockdown corners. So you want to get a third guy on this team. And ideally, you want to find someone who, if they need to do it, can play on the outside. So the first guy we'll talk about, the more expensive option of these two, is Byron Murphy. Played in Arizona. Like our other prospect we'll talk about, he was a second-round pick in the 2019 draft. You see his height. He's kind of right there for being able to play outside, but hey, Darius Williams did at a high level. He's 5'10". Murphy's played all over the field for the Cardinals, and this last year suffered an injury mid-season. That definitely hurt him, but as a player, he's one of the more reliable guys in the slot. He would just be a really good veteran pickup for the team, someone who's kind of in the middle of their career, getting to their best seasons, and he would cost a bit. He'd probably be $27 million if you're signing him for, say, 3 years, about $9 million a year. But if you want to do one big splurge, I think that's a decent way to go. However, I've got another option that I like a little more for this team because, for one, I think it's more affordable. It would be someone who's played near this region as well because he comes from Tampa, same age, player who, as a person, would be a great fit in Jacksonville, helps with your locker room mentality, a good leader. The guy I'm talking about is Sean Murphy-Bunting. And so for him, hopefully I get this right, I believe he was replaced early on this season by Jamel Dean in Tampa Bay. So he didn't have the season go the way he wanted. That's definitely going to impact what he gets paid. But as a player, when you look at like him coming out in the draft and the way they talked about him, a lot of the stuff with him fits really well with what you'd want in Jacksonville. There's still a ton of potential with him. And we saw the Jaguars, like I mentioned, do a really good job with these kinds of players and help them have career years. And so I think this is a candidate that this team could go after, put him in the slot. He can also play outside if you absolutely need it, and fix your defense. Elevate your defense in the secondary. I think he would be a very seamless fit with the Jaguars and the more affordable, obvious option for that part of the secondary. And so what we're looking at for a deal with him is probably about $10 million over 2 years, which is basically what you're paying Dwan Smoot and Arden Key this last season. So would you pay that to a slot corner that filled that need really well, that can be your backup on the outside too? Absolutely. I think that would be great for this team. He would be one of the guys that I would choose to sign. So that's our list of guys. Now, to wrap this up, we're going to look at what it could look like if the Jaguars bring in some of these players, and we're just going to choose a few, not necessarily all of them. And the way I feel about this, I think, quite frankly, you probably want to focus on those defensive needs first, because I think slot corner was such a huge problem to where you want to focus on getting a veteran who can fit in really quick and figure things out. And then on the pass rush, I already think they need a veteran presence. So we're going to add those kinds of players. So we're going to start with Sean Murphy-Bunting. So let's say you do sign a $10 million over 2-year deal. So let's say you do $4 million in signing bonus. So he's getting $5 million the first year in his pocket. It's $3 million against the cap. And then you would guarantee probably $2 million of this. So the reason why is because you want to make sure that he gets the money that he's worth the first season. You just don't count that all against the cap. And obviously he got this $2 million in his bonus, so maybe this is written incorrectly on here. But the point is, he gets $5 million the first year. He gets half this deal. And so the Jaguars, the way it would look if they wanted to cut him after the first season, say it didn't work out, they pay him $3 million the first year and then $2 million in dead cap the second year, which is your prorated bonus. So we add this against the cap. We're sitting at $15 million. Now, if we want to get Justin Houston, let's sign him for 2 years. Because if you sign him for 2 years with his age, I think you get a little bit more affordable of a deal. So let's say it's about $9.5 million to get him for that period. So let's go with $2 million, or no, $4 million. Same base cap there. You'll look at that for the base salary. We won't mess around with the guaranteed and all that. Basically the same idea as Murphy-Bunting, but you're paying him probably $500,000 less that second year. You bring him back for that. You're still above your requirement for cap space. You also would cut 2 players if we want this to be more realistic, if you're keeping your whole draft class. So say we cut Gregory Jr. and it's kind of hard to choose the last guy. We'll just go with Daniel Thomas. So you have almost $14 million. Now you could make a move for Samaje Perine. Let's say they do that. So you're kind of loading up the whole roster, getting all your needs filled. Now, the other option you could have, if you're able to negotiate with Jawan Taylor, that's about enough money to get him back on this team. Because with a backload contract, you're essentially just paying the portion of the signing bonus allocated to that year and the veteran minimum. That's the way they usually deal with it. So with Samaje Perine, get $5.5 million over 2 years. Guarantee $2 million. So he's getting $3 million the first year in his pocket, $2 million against the cap. And that's your cap hit the second year. So essentially what he's getting each year is $3 and then $2.5 million. But the way it counts against the cap is $2 million and then $3.5. So when you transact this, you got to cut another player. And heck, you could still bring back Jawan Taylor at this point. Because you keep in mind, every player that you add on, you subtract another player off your roster for. So because he is about $2 million against the cap, you're going to save about $1 million with your other guy. You're really just having a change of about $1 million in cap space. Let's say Monteric Brown for a moment. Actually, go with Snoop Connor. He might be more of a practice squad player. You're still above the cap. You're still looking pretty good here. And you could have negotiated for Jawan Taylor back, I think, with this scenario. Now, someone else is probably getting renegotiated with. You're probably pushing money down the road for, hey, say, Zay Jones, for example. But in this scenario, you look at where the team is heading into the draft. You have your defensive answers. You can rely on Ben Bartch to start at guard if you need it. You got your tight ends back. You would like to get a receiver, but you could also just look to bring back a guy like Tim Jones. And at running back, you got your second guy who fits the two needs you have. So this team, as it stands before the draft, can compete. And so now you head into the draft with the mindset of we are picking up the best players available. So that's one way to look at it on how they could approach this. Now, let me know what you think. If you've got any free agents you want to let me know about. I haven't got to look at everyone, so I'm not familiar with every free agent available or any of that. Neither will I be probably, because there's hundreds of players on that list. But I think this is a pretty good way of looking at it. You can see the Jaguars can make moves. They can restructure contracts. They can make space to improve this team in free agency and set up for the draft. So let me know what you think. If you've got any agreements, disagreements, what you want to see on the channel. Thank you for taking the time to watch, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.